I'm Tara Palm, Director of Resource Development here at Cristosal, and I want to thank you for joining us today at Field Notes. Whether you've been walking with Cristosal for years or this is your very first time, you are part of a community that believes justice, truth, and voice must be defended across Central America and beyond. These past weeks across the Americas have been a reminder of just how fragile democracy and human rights can be, and how urgently they depend on all of us. At Cristosal, we've entered a new chapter. After suspending operations in El Salvador, we are rebuilding and charting new ways forward, guided by the voices of those most affected. Today, you'll be a part of a conversation between colleagues about the context and communities of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, who are showing extraordinary courage in the face of repression and uncertainty. These are not easy times, but they are also moments when solidarity, truth, and commitment of people like you, like my colleagues here, and the communities we work with make the greatest difference. So thank you for being here. Thank you for standing with Cristosal and the communities we accompany. Let's get started. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Noah Bullock, Executive Director, and René Valiente, Director of Investigations at Cristosal. Welcome, Noah. Welcome, René. Hi, Noah. The last time, let's start with you, Noah. The last time we met here on Field Notes was on July 23rd, just about a week after we suspended operations in El Salvador. Would you start us off by giving a few minutes update on where we have come from in the past few months and where we are today? Or maybe there is a different spot that you'd like to start with today. Over to you, Noah.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. And thanks everyone who stays connected to Cristosal. We've definitely had a lot of upheaval over the last few months. And since we last did a field note, I would say Cristosal has ended sort of an emergency phase, where we, May and June into July, we're concerned about protecting our staff in El Salvador from arbitrary detention, political persecution. We had some of our staff's homes were being monitored by the police. Other members of our leadership team had received threats that they were on lists of people, blacklists of people that would be arrested. We even received a warning at one point that our office was going to be raided and everybody there would be arrested. So it was an environment of fear, and we tried to act as quickly as we could to protect our staff. And we relocated about 20 people to Guatemala and a couple colleagues to Honduras. And I would say that now we're entering more into a normalcy phase, where we're normalcy, even like recognizing that we still have friends and colleagues who are in prison in El Salvador, which never goes away. It's sort of a pain and a sadness that we take with us all the time. But our staff who've been relocated have housing. We've been able to help them connect to basic services, just like sort of the basics of rebuilding lives here. Working on getting residency and working our way through the bureaucracies of the immigration systems in Honduras and Guatemala. But then also, we have the opportunity to get back to normal, thinking about plans, organizational strengthening goals, things that kind of got put in standby a few months ago, really. And so that's kind of where we are organizationally. I think what's come out of this process is a change in sort of an identity of the organization. People heard what happened to us. People are being very generous in all three countries where we work, and see Cristosal as a credible partner, I think. And so that's been a great advantage here in Guatemala. Our staff was relocated, participated in the last few months in a program of dialogues here in Guatemala with different indigenous groups, student groups, community organizations, just to get a sense of the context and also to share our experience from El Salvador with the people. So we've done dialogues with over 300 people now, which is important in sort of defending democracy. Just keeping people talking to each other, I think, is one of the most important things you can do. And we've, I think, begun to get a sense of our new niche and vocation, both here in Guatemala, Honduras. That's what we want to talk about today. But also getting a greater sense of how we move forward with human rights and advocacy towards El Salvador, even from exile. So that's kind of a rundown of it. And in short, I would say that we have been able to close off our emergency phase. Our staff is integrated, and we're going back to normal things like plans and organizational strengthening and staff trainings and things like that, which is nice, actually.
Great. Thanks for that, Noah. So, Renee, let's start with Honduras today. With the elections approaching in Honduras, what obstacles stand in the way of a free and fair participation? So feel free to give a little context if that would be helpful with that question. But let's start with that.
Hello, Tara, Noah, and everyone. Yeah, and Honduras, especially in terms of their electoral process, which is right around the corner, is facing multiple threats, especially considering the participation of very broad sectors of the society. First of all, when discussing about Honduras, it's important to acknowledge the impact of structural violence in the society, particularly in the most vulnerable sectors. Things that are related to high homicide rates, gang violence, organized crime, drug trafficking, are now interacting with a significant increase in state violence, which is led mainly by this state of emergency, which has been implemented since December 2022. This political measure is a security model based on human rights violations, already constitute like very grave violations to the citizens' human rights, which are increased in terms of their participation in the electoral process. But also it opens a very dangerous door to the abuse of authority, as we have seen in El Salvador, for example. In El Salvador, we live the same situation daily. The state of emergency has served as an excuse for human rights violations, And this context of systematic right violations allows the authorities to commit further abuses. In Honduras, in particular, the violence targets the vulnerable people, the people that are living in poverty, that are marginalized. These sectors of society uh, are the main targets in the state of emergency, especially young people. Young people are profiled based on their origins, the way they dress, the kind of sneakers they use, their hairstyle, and they are subjected to abuse, more grave use of force, like beatings, keeping them under surveillance. Young people are taking a big part of the violations in the context of the state of emergency. This, of course, limits their capacity to participate in civic space. Uh, there must be taken into account that the state of emergency also limits formally the right of association, the rights of participation, even basic liberties like being able to move from one uh, department to other are, are it's limited by this measure. Even though this measure is being implemented um, on the basis of uh, public security or reducing crimes like homicide and extortion, but they have seen what is being proved in our reports, in our publications, is that the state of emergency haven't been really effective to fight crime. These sectors of society that have been historically living under violence, living under crime, being victims of homicide and extortion out is still in that situation. But now they are facing different kinds of violence, especially the one coming from the state. We highlight that these human rights violations in our reports, and gladly these have successfully sparked an important debate within the Honduran society. Based on the information that Cristosal made public, senior officials from the Honduran government at the security branch are now publicly discussing the possibility of lifting the state of emergency. This, without doubt, it's a positive impact and provides a very unique opportunity to discuss the failure of this security model based on the widespread promotion of human rights violations.
Do you have any other things that you would like to add to as we think about Honduras and the elections?
Yeah, interesting. I just got a poll. Someone sent me a poll from Guatemala about security and states of emergency. René is talking about how in Honduras, we have been monitoring the impacts of the state of emergency that they declared in Honduras, that was trying to be like a reflection, a model of the Salvadoran state of exception. And here in Guatemala, the polls say that 65% of the population would welcome a state of exception if it improved security. One of the things that has been interesting, we presented our report in Honduras about the state of exception and abuses, and people in Honduras don't really think it's useful. Even what Honduras, what René was saying is that the head of the police, after the report, it seemed like the report was a little catalytic of a conversation in the country about security and about the state of exception. And the head of the police said, get rid of it. It's not useful for me at all. I can still do my work as a police officer without it, without the restrictions of rights. So it was interesting response in Honduras to a security model that it right now seems to be in vogue. It's also what President Trump is trying to sell in Washington and other cities, is this idea of militarized security and security that requires the restriction of rights. But we are working in Honduras with partners to participate in a civil society election observation mission around the elections. But René is also leading a team of investigators that's going to do in-depth monitoring of political violence. And René alluded to this a little bit, but even just up to this point, there's been 5 mayoral candidates killed in the electoral cycle. So we already have outcomes in terms of political violence, and our concern in Honduras is that the polarization between the dominant parties and also the weakening of the electoral institutions there could create a circumstance where there is increased sort of violence or instability after the elections or during the elections, something that's happened in Honduras has happened in the recent past. So we are watching with some anxiety, but hoping for a good outcome.
Thanks for that. And I'll just say to the audience, we're going to save some time for questions, the last part of our time together. So if there are things that you're hearing about Honduras, Guatemala, or Salvador, and you want us to drill down a bit, please feel free to leave questions in the chat, and we'll collect them along the way. So let's shift to Guatemala. Noah, how you mentioned in the beginning about our, listening in all the conversations that we've been a part of. How would you say Indigenous leaders and local communities are shaping civic space here in Guatemala, even in the face of repression?
Well, Guatemala has that unbelievable novelty that the majority of the population identifies with some Mayan ethnic group. And they've demonstrated in recent years real political power, right? A group of people who have never had necessarily equal participation in the democratic system here is the one that shut the country down for 100 days to defend the outcome of an election. And what we're seeing now is some of the reprisals for that. The Attorney General here continues to be a nefarious actor who uses the justice system to persecute judges and attorney generals, and also environmental activists, human rights leaders, but Indigenous leaders. So we now have 3 leaders of Indigenous authorities, 2 different groups, who are being accused of terrorism because of their role in defending the outcomes of the elections and the protests. And the response from them has been really interesting. They've said that we didn't do this as individuals. Our leadership is responsive to an assembly of Mayan communities. We are the ancestral authorities, and we were implementing decisions made collectively among the Mayan people of Guatemala. And that's why we're in prison, they're saying. And one of the things that really has struck me is the narrative in their own campaign in defense of their political prisoners has been, this is the moment of the people, momento del pueblo, and they're calling for people to unite. Which is, I think it resonates to me, at least in all 3 countries that we work in, but I think also for people connected from outside of Central America, there's a sense that political parties aren't going to save us. Maybe there's an absence of sort of political leadership or things like that. It's really a moment of movements of people and solidarity. And so that's the message that the Indigenous authorities are making, and that's a powerful message. Or you asked about civic space. Obviously, the Mayan authorities are not civil society; they are their own organizational structure, but they are playing a role, and they have increased political awareness and power, which is beautiful in some ways. I've had the opportunity to visit some of the leaders in prison, and after that visit, they asked Cristosal to support their cause for freedom. René actually led, sort of represented Cristosal in an assembly meeting in Totonizapan with the 48 cantones. This is one of the strongest Indigenous organizations. I don't know, René, if you want to talk a little bit about your experience representing Cristosal and presenting sort of our story to them and their reaction.
Yes, of course. I was in Totonicapan, I was honored to represent Cristosal in front of these ancestral authorities of the 48 cantones, which are the direction organism that articulates all the indigenous organizations and authorities in the municipality of Totonicapan. We express our solidarity with the of criminalization here in Guatemala that are targeting community leaders and leaders, and especially the cases of Luis Pacheco, the case of recently, the vice major of Solola, which are criminalized because of their participation in the movement 2020-23 that made possible to the president of Guatemala to take office. We as a criminalized organization in Salvador, our experience with expressed our solidarity, especially
Renee,
taking the case. Do you hear me?
real quick for the interruption, sorry. Your Wi-Fi is not as strong as we hope it to be. My apologies. I wonder, Noah, could you maybe take it for a minute to like reflect back on what Renee is going to say?
Yeah, sorry, the internet connection. But René, he represented us at the assembly of the 48 cantones. And I asked him, just to tell the story of Cristosal. This was a response to my visit in prison of Luis Pacheco and Hector Chaclan, and they asked for us to continue to support them. And René told the assembly that Cristosal had suffered. We have our own political prisoners, and then many of us have been forced to flee El Salvador and come to Guatemala. We express our solidarity. I think something that I've talked with René about this, because René's been working also with the Venezuelans who are in the Secot prison. Like in some ways, we feel like a deep solidarity with people who suffer political persecution now, and we have these interesting relationships with Venezuelans. And he told that story, and the response of the indigenous authorities who were administering the assembly was, I think, gratitude for our solidarity, and they, expressed solidarity as well, and a desire to work with us. So it was an interesting encounter, just thinking about how we work together on issues of political prisoners. And in Guatemala, one of the bigger projects we're working on is we're trying to create sort of a collective process of documentation of the political persecution and violence that's happened since the closing of the CICIG here in Guatemala. So the criminalization, killings, exile of people, like I had mentioned before, the judges, the attorney generals, leaders, and a lot of those people are indigenous leaders. So we're trying to create a larger register, and we have buy-in from different organizations like the Alianza por las Reformas, different groups from human rights or spaces that we work in, and we're inviting the indigenous authorities to become part of it. Think of it as like a memory document, and we're also going to be doing sort of legal assessments of cases to demonstrate the patterns of persecution and the illegitimate nature of the instrumentation of the justice system. So as part of our work here, I think in Guatemala is to continue to look at the issue of political prisoners and political persecution. And we see ourselves definitely in solidarity with other groups who have gone through similar situations to us.
Thanks, Noah. Renee, let's try this. We'll try again with El Salvador, perhaps. But I'm wondering, we published a report not too long ago revealing corruption inside prisons. How does this connect to the work that Ruth Lopez was leading before her? And so if you could talk a little bit about that report, and then also how does it connect to the work Ruth Lopez was leading before her arrest?
This report builds definitely on the work that Ruth's been doing at Cristosal over the years. This report compiles the testimonies of individuals affected by the situation by corruption in the Salvadorian prison system. It includes relatives of detainees, even former prisoners, that once recovered their freedom, they were able to tell what happened inside the prisons. This report provides a unique detail of the dynamics of corruption within the Salvadorian prison system. We believe that this reveals one of the cruelest expression of authoritarianism in El Salvador. These practices of corruption in the prison system are like a daily abuse suffered by thousands of families who have some relative deprived of liberty. This is marked by a very profound discrimination, we think, and very systematic human rights violations against directed systematically to the most vulnerable sectors of society. This document reveals how state agents exploit the poorest population and force them to cover expenses that should be paid by a public institution. And the system tries to disguise extortion practice committed by the Salvadorian state as voluntary donations. Some of the testimonies are really, really hard about what happened inside the prisons. People that were supposed to receive some food and clothes and even economic donations made by their families did not receive not even half of what their families were providing. And people were still being asked to provide this money, this food and this clothes and everything, even though their relatives were already dead inside the prison. So we have gathered information from the victims about a system that corrupts the whole Salvadorian prison system. It is particularly important to acknowledge that this prison system is based on systematic human rights violations that happen every day. And as Noah said, I've been working with the case of the Venezuelans that were deported to El Salvador. It is particularly grave that this specific prison system was selected by the authorities in the United States to make a point about migration. El Salvador was not chosen by mistake. It was selected because it wanted to make a message against migration, and they selected especially this prison system because it is built on the systematic violation of human rights. It abuses, it steals, it tortures, and even kills people. That's like the reality of the prison system has been revealed in this report.
Thanks for that, Renee. And I'm glad the Wi-Fi held well for that. It was, Noah, would you add anything else about this question in particular or overall in El Salvador before we get to the questions, which makes me prompt? If you have any questions, make sure you put them in the chat and we'll be getting to them in the next 5 or 10 minutes. Noah, anything?
The report that we just put out about corruption in prisons is a testimonial report. Largely, the evidentiary base is people's testimonies, people who've been in the prisons families who have been bringing food and medicine and clothing. And one of the things that struck me, that one of the primary sources of information are families of people who have died as a consequence of torture in prisons. And when they see the bodies and the state gives what's left of their belongings back to the families, they realize that none of the things that they brought them while they were in prison to keep them alive were given to them. And it's just sort of a really, it's brutal. These are people who were victims of torture. They were killed. They were victims of arbitrary detention. And on top of that, they were victims of corruption and fraud. And, in some ways it shouldn't surprise us. The lack of rule of law, the breakdown checks of powers that permits mass human rights violations is also, the system that creates impunity for an illicit economy within the prisons themselves. And I think this is one of the big takeaways that we made from our report is that all authoritarian systems have to create benefits for the people that collaborate with their illegalities, the illegalities of the regime. And in this case, the people who collaborate with the regime on mass arbitrary detention, torture, killings, they collect that quota from the families of their victims. And it's a brutal reality. And like Renee said, one of the things we've tried to raise is that this is the prison system that was under contract by the United States to disappear hundreds of migrants. And now we have information from those migrants, the Venezuelans who were in prison, that they were also tortured. And so I think that it just gives you a picture of what the restriction of rights means, how that leads to a breakdown of rule of law. Governments that don't respect the rights of people also don't respect the resources of the people.
Before we turn to questions, I'm wondering if anything on either of your is on your end of things that you want to make sure you share about before we get to the questions, whether it be a story or a particular case that we're working on or an interaction.
Yes, here for example, in Honduras, I've been working in a rural area in the department of Cortés, especially in small communities around a place called Aldea Protección. These are farmers that have associated in community small businesses. This place is known as the former banana field. In the context of the state of emergency, these people have suffered like various aggressions, like stigmatization, criminalization, even a physical attacks on their leaders in an attempt to take their communal lands. The Aldea Protección has been targeted by the police and military for search and raids. This community remains in siege by the authorities. They are accusing them of harboring gangs and organized crime and even drug trafficking, which led to the establishment of this cordon around the area, making it very difficult for the people to go to the main cities of the country, even when that travel is for the means of getting medical attention or buying food. And we believe that this is an example of how the state's emergency powers have been used not for security reasons, but to satisfy particular interests, and how the state of emergency has become an excuse to violate the rights of those that the authorities identify as expendables. Cristosal have supported these communities in the filing of complaints with authorities for defending of their rights, but they are still in danger. They're in Cortés.
Thanks, Renee. No, would you say anything else about, I know Renee was breaking up a little bit, anything to clarify there just to make sure, or we can just go to questions?
Yeah, I missed a little of it too, but I would, before we go to questions, I'd like to share something hopefully a little bit uplifting, because we tend to talk about difficult topics, and I know in the U.S. There's been difficult moments too recently, issues around freedom of speech and political violence and censorship. That makes maybe people feel like a little impotent about what can be done. And we've been doing a series of interchanges, sort of dialogues with different Venezuelan groups in exile and journalists and different human rights groups from Venezuela. And in one recent call, we asked them a little bit about what's their theory of change when an authoritarian regime consolidates itself. Like, what do you do? And they gave us really good ideas. But one of the first things they said to us is, one thing that you have to understand is that the change that you are fighting for won't happen tomorrow. And then likely it will be frustrated for many, many years. So you have to have deep clarity about what your spiritual motive is, and like what sustains you in resisting, knowing that you're not going to be successful for the immediate future, right? And so we took that sort of idea, and we had a meeting here in Guatemala with different exile groups from Salvadorans in Mexico, here in Guatemala. We brought some representatives of different civil society groups and social movements in El Salvador, and we posed that question too, right? Like, what will sustain us spiritually in this? What are our motives? And we went around the room, and and I would say that most everybody said something along the lines of, I don't want my children to have to choose between exile and prison. I want my children to know the freedoms that, maybe imperfect freedoms that I've known in my own life, but I want them to know them too. Just a sense that what sustains the struggle is, a vision of a better future. And so that makes, that the struggle can be joyful, even though it's hard a lot of times. I just thought I'd share that, something as people are wondering what to do. I think that helped a lot from our Venezuelan colleagues, just the reminder that things are still worth doing, even if you're not able to change them tomorrow, right? But it does mean that you have to find a way to sustain it, look inwardly and have clarity about your motives.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection. And it's a good one. So let's start with questions. I'm just going to try to get through as many as we can. From Doug. What is Ruth's incarceration situation right now? Where is she being held? What are the conditions? Does she get to see her family, receive medications, etc.? In what prison is she being held in? So.
Yeah, Ruth has been, she was transferred on July 4th to a maximum security prison called El Salco. And since her transfer, she hasn't had access to her family or her legal team. Her lawyers went to the prison and attempted to visit her, and the guards were aggressive and said nobody's been able to visit anybody since President Bukele took office. And so, by international standards, the fact that we haven't been able to verify where she is or how she's doing constitutes a forced disappearance. And we have hope that she is receiving the medicine. Her family receives information or is contacted by the prisons on a regular basis so that they bring the medicine that she needs for her health conditions. We don't have another way to confirm that her health is stable, but that's one of the ways that we think that at least she's getting the medication. So that's a challenge. We are anticipating by the end of the year that she should have another hearing, and we would hope that hearing takes place, and that would be the moment where they were able to move forward on the trial. But two of the other human rights defenders who were in prison 2 weeks ago had their second hearing, and the Attorney General just asked for an extension of the pretrial detention. And so we fear that that is the pattern at this point with most political prisoners in El Salvador, is sort of this indefinite prolongation of pretrial detention. Ruth's case against her, we're not allowed to talk about the trial itself because her trial is secret. But we are asking diplomatic community allies internationally to help to apply pressure so that she could at least have a public trial, and if not a speedy trial, at least a public trial. The original charges that they brought against Ruth were dropped because she could never have committed those crimes, because she never made the funds, so she embezzled them. And then they accused her of illicit association, and in most cases in El Salvador of people accused of illicit association, they don't ever get to like a criminal phase. Usually it's resolved administratively or civilly. So some of these irregularities are what make it really clear that Ruth is in prison because of her role as a human rights defender, not because she has committed any crime. But that is a frustrating situation. Is the justice system in El Salvador is not independent, and in the cases of our other colleagues who have been in prison recently, they haven't had a right to a speedy trial. They haven't had right to have access to their defense. They as well have been disappeared in the prisons, and that's one of the scary parts about that is that these sort of exceptions to due process rights that were promised to combat gangs and terror groups are the ones now used against human rights defenders. It's something to keep in mind as other politicians in other contexts try and offer this seductive bargain of rights in exchange for security.
Thanks, Noah. From Linda, can you compare the possibilities, limits of community organizing now in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala? René, maybe you want to try, maybe give it again, but if I interrupt you, don't try not to feel offended.
No problem. Yeah, the situation in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras is quite different. Even though we share common problems like criminalization and persecution, uh, the level of aggression in the three countries is quite different. El Salvador now is facing like really aggressive public measures against public space, against civil society organizations. This year, from May to the present, 2025, we have experienced like an increase in the criminalization in El Salvador, not only with the imprisonment of our colleague Ruth, but there are also community leaders, human rights defenders, environmental lawyers, even people who only raise their voices to defend those that couldn't do it. For example, one of our colleagues has been in prison just for defending the case of Ruth, Enrique Anaya. We also have other community-based organizations that felt threatened because it's not only that they are criminalized or they are taken to prison, because the state is leading some actions that make the people in charge of this organization feel unsafe. They spread rumors. They start doing some harassment in social networks or media. So the criminalization and the persecution can be understood if we attend like the political violence in the region. So in El Salvador, we experience like a raise in the political violence. This is also present in the other countries because, as Noah said, in Honduras, in the context of the electoral process, we have had by the time 5 killings of people related to the process of candidates for the Congress and municipalities. But there are also other threats to civic space, especially those coming from the states of emergency. I, there must we must understand that in Honduras we have a restriction on the freedom of association and freedom of speech and other basic human rights and those of the due process of law guarantees that are suspended in Honduras because of this measure, and this make it really hard for civil society organizations to be part of the public space. The same in Guatemala. Coming from a different source here in Guatemala, there are destructions, corrupting organizations like Ministerio Público and the public attorney. Here they are leading criminalization against leaders. These have like a very a very wide context because we find in the criminalization processes we find something related to some part of them of those cases are related to vengeance from what happened in 2023 or people who led the fight against impunity from CICIG. Then we have a very clear discrimination kind of cases that are led to against community leaders and indigenous leaders. But what all these cases have in common is they are a manifestation of corruption and impunity. They are defending the power of those who were left with no public power in the election of 2023. So, making like analysis of the whole region, the three countries have threats for civil society organization, the civic space. The three countries are experiencing closing of their civic space, but the situation is quite different in each one of these countries.
Thanks, Renee. A few more questions here. From Bonnie, what is the best, any insights on the best way to inquire about loved ones in hospitals? Do we know the main cause of kidney failure being seen in the populace? Just any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I'm not sure if the question is oriented towards kidney failure as one of the causes of death in prisons, but that is one of the primary causes of death that we're finding in cases of people who are dying in custody of the state. The causes of the kidney failure, when we work with forensic investigators, are generally beatings to the thorax of people that destroy their internal organs and then cause very accelerated kidney failure deaths, which usually kidney failure is a slower process, especially in young men. And the other is the lack of access to water or being able to go to a bathroom. So being deprived of sort of basic necessities can generate very fast processes of kidney failures. Families are usually notified very much at like the last minute before death. That there definitely is a problem with being able to have access or for families to be able to verify the health of their individuals. And so one of the, obviously Cristosal finds out about these scenarios usually, after they've led to a fatality. Finding prisoners in the hospitals is a huge challenge for sure. It's a totally opaque system. We don't, just imagine there's no formal register of who's in prison. So then being able to, or what prison people are in, and so, or at least not a publicly available one. So following those people to hospitals and things like that is a challenge.
I'm kind of going to bop around here, and Noah, Renee, if you see questions that you want to bring out too, because there's probably more than we can get to. But I thought I would go up to Ren's question about what role is the U.S. government now taking in relations to these countries?
It's a tough question to answer in some ways, because of how there doesn't seem to be like a absolutely clear policy framework by the U.S. There's more of a general one, and the general framework is that the U.S. wants Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras fundamentally to receive their deported citizens and other nationalities too. And so that seems to be like the overarching framework. And then there's some differences that have to do with ideology and diplomacy. Guatemala, interestingly, from our perspective, is one of the more democratic governments in the region, but one that has a pretty constructive relationship with the Trump administration. There's some speculation about why that is, but at least it's clear that people who previously were from the U.S. Were adversaries of like the secede are now partnering with a government who sees their adversaries as being people from the public ministry who were persecuting people from the secede. And in Honduras, there's definitely at least from some sectors of the Republican Party, there's an ideological conflict. The Libre Party, that is the government, identifies very openly as being a left socialist party. They seem to be sympathetic at some points with different, even authoritarian leftist governments in the region. And so that generates kind of a more adversarial dynamic with them, but I think ultimately it's transactional too. As long as they receive deported people, then there's not like a huge. El Salvador, I think, is its own place where it has been or made a concerted effort, spokesperson, some far right issues and aligned very close to President Trump, the candidate, or some sons, Matt Gates, house in El Salvador, and so he became a part of that, at least communications system and in pain of terror, right? So that's a relationship for sure.
Thank you. And Wi-Fi all is struggling, so I appreciate just with it's part of the solidarity. Maybe let's one last question and then we'll close. From Jonathan, what is the status of transitional justice cases in El Salvador? Cristosal process several years ago.
We are not resigning our role in the transitional justice cases in El Salvador. We have a case of a death squad in San Miguel that, over a year ago should have been elevated to the final phase of the trial and a conviction. And we would say the same thing about Mozote, that case was ready to be elevated to the final phase of the trial at least 4 years ago. And since they overthrew the judge, that process is stalled out. And then we represent also the victims of a massacre called Calabozo, and also a family of a forced disappearance from the armed conflict period. And so our lawyers have not resigned those cases. We continue to, in the case of El Mozote, put the last pieces together of what we call our final indictment, which is just the sum of all the evidence and the legal and the theory of the case that we have, that we hope to be able to present to the court even from a distance, and try and force the court to make a decision about whether to elevate it to the final trial phase. Something similar we would like to do. We have some colleagues who are still in El Salvador that on a volunteer basis will be able to help us to do some of the clerical side of that work. But we probably won't be talking about that too publicly. So we haven't given up on it yet, and we do want to see some of the processes through. Tara, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry, everybody. I think this might be a good place to wrap up. So thank you for joining us and for listening so deeply. I feel like our listening so deeply had other types of listening today with our Wi-Fi. So thank you for being here. What you've heard today from René and Noah is more than stories or context. It's the living testimony of people fighting for dignity and justice and democracy in Central America. Our work is only possible because of the community we build together here. And I invite you to stay connected, share what you've learned, consider deepening your support, and above all, continue to stand with those voices that are too often silenced. I also wanted to mention we will be in person this fall, a few different places in DC, in New York City, in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania, and Durham, North Carolina. If you are near, we will try to keep you all updated on where we're going to be because we would love to see you in person. So on behalf of Cristosal, thank you. Your solidarity sustains this work and ensures that even in difficult times, justice has defenders, truth has witnesses, and voices are not silenced. So thank you, Noah. Thank you, René. Thank you for everybody here. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Field Notes. Until then, thank you for being a part of this movement. Bye-bye.